Remember I said earlier that there are two different types of evolution, microevolution and macroevolution. Remember that microevolution is on a small scale. It's just affecting just one population, one set of creatures. This happens through a mutation process in the overall DNA, the genetic genome of that population. We can also go through natural selection, genetic drift. Gene flow is another mechanism of microevolution, and then non random mating, or what we would call sexual selection, where mates are actually not picked on random. There's some sort of sexual selective process that goes along with finding your mate. And these mechanisms, there's 5 mechanisms that we're going to talk about in microevolution, are happening to, when we're talking about this, it's like one population. So, like all of the bunnies in the field kind of thing. All right, so our first mechanism to talk about in microevolution is mutations. So, a mutation is any change in the DNA sequence that can happen. This creates a new genotype most often, and then, of course, a new phenotype. Once you get a new genotype and you change the sequence, you could possibly get an entirely different protein that could be made. You know, you're changing an amino acid or part of the sequencing. Thus, you can express that differently in a protein, in a phenotype. And so the changes in allele frequency in a population are going to change. How common is this allele in this gene pool? Well, these mutations, often if they're advantageous, they can definitely increase variation in the population. And that is a huge driving force of evolution. It's happening on a small scale because it's happening to one individual, like it happened during crossing over or during conception. And so now we have this allele frequency variation. It can also be harmful or sometimes, neutral and just not affect the population whatsoever. But we do know a lot of the variety that we see, especially in humans, have come from a mutation that occurred. Red hair is a great example of a mutation that occurred in a melanin production where, most are born with a melanin productive allele, which will give them brown hair to black hair. And then the absence of that will be blonde hair. So the recessive of that will be, not have any melanin production within hair. But then we see this mutation that occurred in that allele sequence, and that caused the frequency of those to change, and that mutation was red hair. Natural selection, by definition, is when organisms are more fit for their environment. They're going to survive to be more reproductive, and more reproductive individuals create more offspring, and therefore the pool of available genes can change by those more successful individuals. So if they have a beneficial trait, some sort of adaptation, they're going to become more common over time. A non-advantageous adaptation can definitely lead to, death and low reproductive rates. And we see this, Darwin expressed this in his finches, where he noticed that on the island there were a bunch of different types of finches, and we think of them as birds all doing the same thing. But in reality, if you look at them, they all had different types of beaks. These birds had different kind of beaks, like pointy beaks for hitting into the side of a tree, like a woodpecker almost, and getting inside of the bark to get out the grubs and the insects inside of them. And then we see these much larger beaks, which with jagged edges, which were more for grinding. So on the ground, if you were foraging for seeds, you would be able to get to those seeds and the nutritious part on the inside. If you could pick them up and you had larger jaws, and you were able to grind. And if you have just, or I'm just going to call it normal, normal beak of a finch, then you can pick seeds up off the ground, or you can fly into, the tree line and be able to pick them up in variety, But having all of these different types of beaks would allow them to not have as much competition amongst all the different types of finches, giving each one an area to feed and a place in the system to live, therefore separating all of those types of finches and creating this natural selective process where the ones that had developed these large beaks to take on nuts that were big grinding that nuts they had to grind that were on the ground, that is a food source that adaptation was allowing the finch to tap into, therefore creating that particular finch to be more successful. And so that large beak showed up more frequently in the population. Genetic drift is one of those just random event occurrence. We call that by chance. So if by chance something occurred in a population that would allow a particular type of allele to become more common or more frequent, then it happens, right? It happens. So if by random chance something changes in the allele population over time, then we call that a genetic drift. These rare alleles in a population will just decrease in their frequency, especially if they are recessive, to be quite honest. We'll see them less frequent because they're representative of a smaller part of the population. And so we often see this loss in genetic variation through genetic drift. So in my example here, let's just say that this is my original population of roses, and I'm going to take these 3 roses and they're going to breed, and this is going to be my new population of roses. And then by some sort of chance, a tree falls and crushes some of those flowers. And what is left are these 3 flowers here, and they're left to reproduce. And now we have this new population that looks very different from the original population, and we basically lost the genetic variation due to genetic drift. In order to get that variation back in microevolution, we can go through a process of gene flow. A species, a population can have movement of genes in and out of that population. Think about it as migratory. So some species will just migrate in a population, like whether they're migrating through or if some obstacle has been put in their way that has rerouted them. So this results in an increase in the genetic diversity of a population. We see a lot of this in change in color, especially of insects, things that have a high mobility rate because they're always constantly moving, and then they'll put something like a huge farm where there's lots of things to kill beetles in that farm in the way, and so one variation of that species will reroute itself and bump into another population, and we see now this increase in genetic diversity. We call that gene flow. Sexual selection is a mechanism for microevolution that can be harmful in addition to beneficial. So we also call this non-random mating, and it's just when the selective process of traits aren't really always for the purpose of survival. Sometimes without them, like life would be okay. It's just that we have some sort of process where the females are choosing a male, most often, that has something that allows it to become more attractive to the female. Therefore, she's a little bit choosy, and she'll produce she would want to mate with that particular male, and more of his offspring will be available. So peacocks, the males have this huge plumage display of these beautiful feathers. And if you've ever seen the gray peacocks at the zoo, those are actually the girls. The girls will select non-randomly, so on purpose, the fellas that have the largest display of beautiful feathers. And so what we see is that when females start to non-randomly or select, we see this bottleneck effect of genes, where we have all of this variety, but only so few are selected, and so the gene pool is bottlenecking in its availability of variety. So genetic equilibrium is reached when there are no changes in that allele frequency in a population over time. So if genetic equilibrium, also known as Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, is reached, we're not going to see a population frequency of alleles change in a population over time. So evolution's not going to occur if the population is really large. Evolution's not going to occur if, there is random mating. And if we don't have any mutations in a process and there's no natural selective process and nobody's entering the population, then we will not have evolution occur. But if at least one of these conditions is there, then the population is by all means mathematically evolving.